Welcome to Train Signal. You are watching Administering SRM. Welcome to this lesson on the administration of SRM. I think you'll like the content. In this lesson, we'll focus on the skills you'll need to adjust your SRM setup to respond to the inevitable changes in your environment, as well as help you with the day-to-day activities you may be required to handle as part of an administrator for an SRM environment. In this lesson, you'll learn how to administer protection groups and protected VMs. We'll also cover protected data store administration and how to add new protected data stores to expand capacity. We'll show you how you can adjust inventory mappings and troubleshoot issues related to incomplete mappings caused by folks changing of resources on the protected or recovery sites. We'll also create and manage SRM alarms. We'll cover how to configure access control and get into some of the best practice on this security topic. We'll overview SRM logging, and we'll finish with a quick demo on recovery plan reporting. This is an important lesson to help you keep the lights on your shiny new SRM installation. So let's get ready and let's hit it. Okay, now let's discuss protection group administration. There is one constant in life and in IT, and that is change. Setting up an SRM environment is not a one-and-done proposition. The system will need to be continually tweaked and improved based on the lessons learned from the DR tests that you're doing to refine your SRM configuration. And you'll also have changes as you add protected VMs or as you change settings within your protected environment. This lesson will help the SRM administrator respond to those changes. And we're going to focus first, though, on the administration of the protection group. Now, changes to the protection group start with storage. That's the key piece to take away with protection groups in general, right? They're created on top of replicated VMware data stores. So what this means is a lot of protection group administration is going to focus on the data store level, and you'll just need to be aware of that. There's going to be three major options for how you can add or remove protection from virtual machines, which we'll discuss. Deploy from template or creating a new virtual machine on a protected data store is one of the common ways that you can add protection to a VM. Once you're done with that, you would then configure protection on the new VM, which will show you the distinction between that and just placing the VM on the data store. The other way that you can change a protection group or add, subtract VMs is to use storage remotion or cold migration to move the storage of a virtual machine from a protected data store to an unprotected data store. Once you're done with that, you would then remove protection from the virtual machine. The third option is to storage remotion or cold migrate a virtual machine from a protected data store into maybe possibly another protected data store. That would be one way to maybe shuffle things around. In that instance, it would get a little difficult, or not a little difficult, but a little hybridized in how you would respond to that. So when you move the VM from a protected data store, you would then need to remove protection on it so that the shadow VMs at the recovery site aren't reflecting that that VM lives in a certain data store that it doesn't any longer. So once you've removed the protection, you would then need to go into the new protection group that's servicing that replicated data store, and then you would need to add protection back in onto that virtual machine. I'll show you that in a demo in just a second, though. After moving to new storage or creating new replicated volumes, you'll need to make sure that you configure or remove protection on the affected virtual machines. And we've hinted at that a little bit in the above options for administering protection groups. It'll really make sense as we go in and demonstrate that. So let's go ahead and do that without further ado. I say it's demo time. Okay, now we're ready to begin the demonstration for how you would go about administering a protection group and doing some of the common activities associated with it. As you can see, I'm logged into the protected site here. How do we know that? Well, if we go to the Site Recovery tab, look at Local Site, sure enough, it says Protected Site. If I go through down to Protection Groups, I can see where we have some warnings. Well, earlier we were talking about adding and removing virtual machines from protection. Well, in the case of these warnings, it's because we've added some virtual machines to a protected data store, which was in this case VMFS1 was the name of it. Well, since there was already some virtual machines protected, they're fine, but SRM immediately sees that there's other virtual machines on that volume that haven't gone through the configure protection step. This will basically come down to making sure that they're using the exact same inventory mappings that the other VMs are, and that there's nothing out of the ordinary. There's a couple options here. We could configure all, which I think would be the route to go. Otherwise, we can also do configure protection, which would configure each VM individually. I don't really like that idea because I'd like to see all the virtual machines within a protection group configured identically. Test box 4, however, is a test box. It has been added into this data store by mistake, so I'm not sure if I want to configure protection for it. However, I'm going to need to remove it from that data store in order to take the protection away. So let's do that first before we configure protection on critical PC. So I go back to home screen, I'll take a look at my inventory, and we'll see we've got a couple of test box here. Test box 4 and test box 3, both of them on VMFS1. I'm going to actually move them. Change the data store that they're located on. Leave them in the test resource pool. I would put them on local storage since I don't really need them. I don't want them to be protected, taking up all that space. And since this is a pretty small virtual machine, this should not take long at all. It's completed. Test box 3 also shows that it's on that data store. We're going to delete it and get rid of it. This test box no longer needed it. I talked to the business owner. They're fine. Okay, well, now that we've removed that virtual machine from the protection group to clean up the protection, it's time to configure protection on critical PC2 so that it can be protected along with the other virtual machines. To do that, we'll simply just click on that virtual machine. I like to use the configure all so that all virtual machines get the same settings for recovery. Are you sure you want to continue? Of course. So click the yes. Great, and now we've configured protection on critical PC2. If we were to switch over to the recovery site, you would then be able to see that there's some new this is the recovery site, and you'll see that I now have 3 shadow VMs created in a DR resource pool, which is the resource pool that I have all of my all of my protected virtual machines pointed to within that group. So that's how you configure protection on virtual machines added into a protection group. But since we've walked through the steps of setting up a new protected data store, I'd like to show you how you can then scan for that data store and create a new protection group for the virtual machines to be stored on that new protected data store. We'll do that in just a second. Administering protected data stores is an important task that you'll likely need to master, since your first replicated data stores probably won't have infinite capacity. You'll likely need to add data stores over time, or replace data stores in the case of a storage migration to a new storage vendor or additional array within your environment. This section will review the common tasks that you'll need to know in order to do that. First, we start with adding storage capacity for SRM. And adding storage capacity for SRM involves creating new replicated SAN volumes and adding them into the ESX server so they can see them, and then adding to SRM through the Array Manager configuration. I'll demonstrate that in just a second. But you might have reached capacity on your storage device. In that case, you may have to add a second storage array, and quite possibly from a different vendor. As long as the array vendor is on VMware's compatibility matrix for SRM, you'll be good to go. But in addition to the steps above, don't forget to install the new SRA for the new SAN. Remember that the SRA is the storage replication adapter. It's what talks to the storage array from SRM. So without that new SRA that the new SAN would require, there's no way you're going to configure it with SRM. So if you refer back to our lesson installing SRM, you'll have the information you need to complete that step. Also, when getting started, it is common to promote an existing replicated data store in your environment to the protected status. As long as there are virtual machines on it, there won't be a problem with doing this, since you'll need virtual machines on a data store in order for SRM to see it when it gets scanned. But not all virtual machines on this existing data store would probably need protection. You might have production workloads mixed with test and dev. In that case, you'll need to use storage vMotion or cold migration to move the virtual machines off that protected data store and onto a less critical either local data store or just a data store that's not being replicated. You would also need to then configure protection on the virtual machines that you left on that newly protected data store. If the new VMs use resources that currently aren't mapped by the inventory mapping of SRM, you might also have to update those relationships prior to configuring protection. In the following demo, I'll show you how you can add capacity for the new protected virtual machines. To do this, we'll create some new replicated SAN volumes on the storage that we have set up in our lab, and we'll configure replication on those volumes so that SRM would recognize them as something that can be protected. We'll then present that storage to the ESX servers and configure them for production use. Finally, we'll add the protected data stores into SRM through the Array Manager configuration and allow the Array Manager to rescan that storage device to look for replicated volumes. One key piece of note here, we need to make sure that there's one virtual machine on that new data store, otherwise SRM won't be able to detect it. So an additional step here would be to create a virtual machine or move a virtual machine to the new volume. Are you ready? Well, let's get started with adding capacity for our SRM setup. First step we're going to do here is we're going to pretend that we've run out of protected space on our SRM setup. And we now need to add a new replicated volume to serve as a data store that could be protected and store protected virtual machines. To accomplish this, we'll need to create a new replicated volume on our protected storage system. So if you remember back, we use HP left-hand VSA, or Virtual SAN Appliance, for this lesson. I'm going to go into the protected side. I have a protected cluster and a recovery cluster. I'm going to go under volumes and create new volume. We'll call this guy VMFS2 because I'm very creative in my naming capacities. And we'll give it a size of 40 gig. And since I don't have much actual disk space, I like to use thin provisioning. So I'll use thin provisioning so that we can get a larger LUN on less space. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and click OK. I could assign servers here. We'll click OK. There's no assigned server, so we'll go ahead and say new server, which I could enter in a brand new server. What's easier for me within the left-hand setup here is to actually go to servers. Click on the protected ESX1 that we have out here. I can assign a volume to that server by simply clicking the checkbox for VMFS2. That's the easiest way. Great, now that we have the volume, we need to configure replication on it so that it can be seen by SRM. To do that, we'll right-click on this and say New Scheduled Remote Snapshot of Volume, or Replication. We'll select a start time so that this can begin replicating. 9:04 works for me. We'll have it follow a similar schedule as our other volume does, and that's 30 minutes. We'll then also retain these snapshots for a maximum of 3. It's pretty easy. The remote snapshot group, however, we need to click Recovery Group. And click on New Remote Volume. We'll add this new remote volume to the existing cluster. Recovery cluster selected. We'll call it Replica of VMFS2. Click Finish. Then we'll just need to set the retention policy, which will do 3 snapshots as well. Once all that is done, we can go ahead and click OK. We've now created a replicated SAN volume. And once it's already triggered. It's replicating the metadata of the volume right now, since there's no actual data on this volume. So now we have two volumes with replication established. The first already has 3 snapshots. The second just has this one first initial snapshot. So that's great. We've created the volume, we set up replication, we've assigned it to a server. Now we need to go back into vSphere client and make sure that the ESX servers can see it. All right, here we are logged into the vSphere client to the protected site. To add this iSCSI volume into the protected site's ESX server, you'll click the ESX server. We'll go to configuration, and under make sure that the iSCSI software adapter is selected. We'll do a rescan. Click OK to begin that process. Great, we've now see 2 volumes where before we only saw 1. So since this is a brand new volume, we'll need to quickly go in and create a VMFS data store on that new volume. To do that, we click Add Storage under the Storage section. Disk and LUN. There's only 1 volume that's left there, so I'll select it. Excuse me, that's only 1 unformatted volume. So we select our volume, and then we'll give it a name, VMFS2, and click Next. We'll just select the defaults for now. And at the end of this, we should see that we have a VMFS volume that can now be used to store protected virtual machines. Great, VMFS2. But before it can be used by SRM, we'll need to create a virtual machine to live on it. To do that, I'll just take this little test box, which is a very small, lightweight DOS virtual machine that VMware can provide through the Virtual Appliance Marketplace. It's called Nostalgia, if you're looking for it. Anyway, I'm going to clone that virtual machine into test machine number, give it 6 to make sure that we're completely unique here. And then go ahead and click Next. Choose where it should live. This is all old hat for you VI masters out here, but right here we need to make sure we select VMFS2. So in your scenario, if you're adding a brand new replicated volume, you would actually choose probably a mission critical virtual machine to move to this new data store so that you could then protect it with SRM. In my case, I'm just throwing something simple on it so that it can be seen by SRM and can be scanned for the demonstration. So I'll go ahead and click Next and choose thin provisioning because I like it. Then click Next and finish. Once this is done cloning, we'll then have a virtual machine living on that protected data store that we could then use to trigger the SRM scanning process or make the SRM scanning process aware that there's a virtual machine on that could be protected. Okay, we've added that replicated data store and we've created a virtual machine on that data store so that it can be sensed by the SRM configuration wizard. We're now ready to add this data store into SRM so that it's available to create a protection group on it. To do that, we log into the site recovery plugin on the protected site. As you can see, we're here in the protected site. This configuration will be done through the Array Manager section. So I'll go ahead and click Configure under Array Managers. If you're paying attention very closely, you'll note that the device count down here is now 2. We only started out with there being 1 data store being in use, which I can explain that in that I've already done this scanning, so to speak, with the new volume. I just didn't want to recreate the lab to record this lesson. So pretend that this is 1 for now, and I'll walk through the exact same steps that you would need to do to have that newly added data store show up for SRM. You shouldn't have to do anything up here if that new data store was added to an existing scan. So we'll go ahead and click Next at the screen. Same for the recovery site array managers. We're not adding anything new. All we want to do is rescan the available array managers to see for new replicated volumes. Again, this says 2. Pretend it says 1. Thank you. I'll click Next here. And in the event that this was done for the first time, you wouldn't see VMFS2. And you'd only see VMFS1. So what we needed to do to have that show up was click Rescan Arrays down in the lower right-hand corner. And click Yes to continue. After a few short moments, it would report all the data store groups that it could see that are 1, connected to the array managers we've added, and 2, have replication configured within the SAN itself, and also as a third option, they have a virtual machine stored on them. Otherwise, they won't be seen in this step. And I'll expand these so that you can get an idea, but device 1 is VMFS1, device 2, VMFS2, and they're both replicated. So I'll click Finish. We have now added the new replicated data store so that we have additional capacity in which to protect virtual machines. And we've also added a virtual machine onto that new protected data store. So now we're ready to create a second protection group on top of that newly created data store. To do that, under Protection Groups, we'll go ahead and click Create. This protection group we'll probably call Protection Group VMFS2. I click Next. In this data store group section, you can see that the VMFS1 data store is grayed out. That's because it's already assigned to another protection group. So what I can do is select the only data store group I have available, which is VMFS2, which should not be confused with VMFS version 2, as in the file system. This is just the name I chose so that you could understand it was a VMFS data store. Anyway, once that's collected, go ahead and click Next and fill out the location for where you'd like to see placeholder VMs stored. I'm going to choose the Shadow VMs VMFS data store and click Next. Great, now I have 2 protection groups created. And I've also added protection to test machine 6, which was that test machine that we created earlier, or that virtual machine that we moved onto that newly created data store. To show you what that looks like, I'll quickly shift over to Recovery VC. And as you can see, under Dev and Test, we now have Test Machine 6. Let's shift back for just a second, because inside of Protection Group, yep, that's right, we have protection configured. And to double check how we had that configured, I'm just going to go ahead and edit this group for a second. Very good. Shadow VMs. So pretty simple stuff. We've created that protection group for VMFS2. We've now showed you all the steps that you need to do to create a new replicated data store, to present that to the ESX servers, add a virtual machine to it so it can be seen by SRM, and we also did a rescan of the data stores through the SRM configure array manager section. And finally, we created a protection group specifically for that new data store. So now you can add virtual machines to that data store and protect more virtual machines with SRM. All right, let's dive a little deeper on inventory mappings. If you remember, inventory mappings establish recovery site defaults for folders, networks, and resource pools. That is, they map resources that VMs use at the protected site to the resources that they'll need to use when they're recovered at the recovery site. A couple things to think about here is that if you create additional resources at the protected site, they won't necessarily mess up the recovery plan for virtual machines, since the placeholder VMs would have already been created for protected virtual machines. And it is the placeholder VM's configuration that defines how a protected virtual machine will be recovered at the recovery site. As long as the recovery site resources haven't changed in any way, you are okay with the VMs being recovered the same as the placeholder VMs. However, there is an issue if you have new protected VMs that leverage unmapped inventory. And actually, I should say, that's new VMs that you would like to protect. If they are assigned to a resource pool or a new network port group that hasn't been assigned through the inventory mappings, you will not be able to protect them until those inventory resources get assigned to the recovery site counterparts. And I'll demonstrate that later in the following demo. Also, real problems will occur if the recovery site inventory changes and the placeholder VMs get out of sync. That is, the placeholder VMs are pointing to some recovery site resources that maybe no longer exist or have been swapped out for other resources. In this case, you have a couple of options to fix the situation. One is that you may need to just edit the placeholder VMs to reflect the changes that have happened at the recovery site. This is just as simple as doing edit settings on the placeholder VM itself and changing it to an available network or possibly resource pool. My preferred method for now is to remove protection on all the VMs in a protection group and do a configure all for VMs in the group after you have updated the inventory mappings for the new recovery site resources. In this way, you can be sure that a large group of virtual machines gets the identical configuration that they need based on the mappings. It's a little easier to to preserve good change control using this method rather than manually changing a bunch of virtual machines and opening up the possibility for some issues for people not getting it right. An exercise to possibly explore here to make this a little easier, if you say if you have a protected group with dozens of virtual machines, going through each one individually might be kind of a laborious duty. So creating a PowerShell script to go through and update the protection automatically might be something to explore, especially if you do it quite often. Well, that's enough PowerPoint for this section. Let's go ahead and show you how it's done, how you can go in and administer the changes to inventory mappings.